Howdy folks, welcome back to the Stick Figure Historian. In today's episode, we're jumping back into the Whiskey Rebellion. So, last week we kicked off with explaining what the whiskey tax was, where it came from, who started it, how Hammy and friends were favoring big business with it, all that fun stuff. We return now to the angry farmers in Pennsylvania. Why were they so upset about Alexander Hamilton's tax on liquor? I mean, on the surface, the tax seemed simple. Just a little extra money to pay for an unneeded item. A luxury tax, some called it. Or, as the more snooty of the religious folk preferred to term it, a sin tax, since they thought drinking liquor was a sin. But in reality, this tax was ruining the livelihood of these farmers. Let me break it down for you. So, these farmers' chief crops were grain products, okay? They grew barley, rye, corn, and things like that. Some of it they used to feed their families, but the rest they wanted to sell. This would make money to buy the things that they couldn't grow. And the best place to sell their grain was in the big eastern cities, like Philadelphia. But Philadelphia lay over on the eastern side of the Appalachian Mountains, miles and miles away over rugged, rocky trails. To take a wooden wagon heavy with sacks of grain over those mountain passes took a long time. And if the grain happened to become wet during the passage, it would spoil. And so, you see, the farmers had come up with a better way to transport their goods to market. Instead of hauling the heavy bushels of grain over the mountains, they would make whiskey out of it. The farmers made their grain into whiskey using a process called distilling. First, they cooked the grain in water and made a sort of mush or porridge out of it. Then they let the mush sit and ferment for a while. Once it had fermented, the mush was put into a contraption called a still. In the still, the mush was boiled again, and the yeasty liquid made from the fermentation process would rise up to the top of the still and leak out into another pot through a tube. This stuff in the second pot was whiskey. All the farmers had to do then was let this whiskey sit for a while again. This was called maturing, and then it could be drunk or sold to others to drink. It took a lot of grain to make a little bit of whiskey. So, by turning it into whiskey, the farmers could bring just a few bottles and jugs over to sell in Philadelphia. It was much lighter than many cumbersome sacks. It wouldn't matter if it got wet, and it never spoiled. Besides this, whiskey also served as a kind of money out on the frontier where these farmers lived. Gold and silver money were scarce. There just simply wasn't enough to go around between everyone to do business with. So, oftentimes, instead of paying for things with coins, a man would pay with jugs of whiskey. Most everyone respected this as a form of currency, and it held its value well. Now, with this new tax, the little Pennsylvania farmers had to make the price of their whiskey higher when they sold it in the big cities. But since the big businesses that made lots of liquor didn't have to pay as much tax, they could keep their prices low. Remember how they only had to pay 6 cents a gallon, while the smaller producers had to pay 9? Quite naturally, since people usually like to pay less money for things, customers started buying more whiskey from the big producers instead of the little farmers. Losing business was not the only problem. The tax had to be paid in coin. And as I said before, coins were a scarce thing on the frontier. it would be hard for most people to scrounge up what they needed to cover the tax. And since the tax was making it more difficult and expensive to make whiskey, it was changing the drink's value as a currency as well, creating more complications in daily life. So you may see now why the over-mountain farmers were rather angry about the tax, and why it wasn't so simple after all. This tax was ruining one of the only ways that they could make money for their families. It wasn't as if they could take the whiskey and sell it somewhere else either. Spain had an iron grip on the Mississippi River and wasn't going to have any part of Americans using it. It will also help us to have a better understanding if we look a bit into the heritage and past history of these Pennsylvanian farmers. Most of these men were either immigrants or direct descendants of immigrants from Ireland, particularly from the province of Ulster in the north part of Ireland, which, not to complicate things too much, was actually a place heavily settled with people from Scotland. Although, really, a lot of the original people of Scotland actually came from Ireland way back in the 800s, so it's actually kind of like they made one big multi-century circle. But I guess if we want to go farther back, according to the old chronicles, some of the old people of Ireland actually came from Spain. They weren't Spanish though. It was actually a Greek prince who came over. But I guess we could do that for any people group and just keep going back until, well, you know. Anyhow, let's stick with simplicity here. So, these dudes came over from a Scottish settlement in Ireland. Hence, these people are often known as Scots-Irish. And yes, that's Scots-Irish, not Scotch-Irish. Okay, just setting that straight. Anyhow, there was a pretty big population of them in America. These Scots-Irish were a hardy, stubborn, and fierce people. They had entered heart and soul into the war for independence from England, and they had formed a very large part of George Washington's fighting force when he was a general. They had believed in the cause of liberty. They wanted no taxation without representation. And even now, many of these devoted soldiers had yet to be paid for all their efforts. But they were content, so long as they could live in a free land. But it wasn't free. That's what these Scots-Irish farmers were coming to see. They didn't feel that they had proper representation in their government. The big cities had lots of say in Congress, and the backwoods country people had precious little. That's how Hamilton could get laws and taxes passed that favored big businessmen. And the farmers were angry. Had they fought the war in vain? This was the very taxation without representation that they had given everything to fight against years ago. They had no method of protest against the tax. And since many of them had never learned figuring, reading, or writing, they knew it would be all too easy for a tax collector to cheat them without them even knowing it. No, they decided. They wouldn't stand for this. Better to fight the nation you had helped to create than let it run roughshod over you.